Chapter 7. The Government Traps. Governments play a very important part in most people's lives. Well over 1/3 of one's income is spent for various taxes: income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, import duties, although some of the taxes are paid indirectly through the costs of products and thus not noticed. The significance of government can be demonstrated by a look at any daily newspaper on any day of the week. The coverage given to news concerning governments is overwhelming. Because of these things, it's not surprising that most people turn first to government whenever they become concerned about their freedom. They assume either that the government must do something to help them be free, or that the government is obstructing their freedom. But few people have ever considered exactly what a government is, so they keep trying through government to increase their freedom without ever understanding their failures. They waste a great deal of their freedom working to affect the government through voting, politics, educating others, who are in turn supposed to affect the government, protesting, etc. Their freedom is wasted because most of the popular assumptions about government won't hold up under close examination. I think there are 4 basic government traps. Popular misconceptions about the nature of government. 1. The belief that governments perform socially useful functions that deserve your support. 2. The belief that you have a duty to obey laws. 3. The belief that the government can be counted upon to carry out a social reform you favor. 4. The fear that the government is so powerful that it can prevent you from being free. When I was a young man, if anyone had suggested to me that those beliefs were mistaken, I would have been aghast. But today, I know they are all misguided. The subject of government is fascinating, for it has to do with how you, me, and everyone else gets what he wants in daily intercourse with others, and how that's affected by governments. A close investigation of the subject can produce surprising conclusions. So let's take a closer look. The market. As we have seen before, all individuals are different, fortunately. Without such differences, there would be very little diversity in what is produced. There would be no specialization of labor. As it is, there's a wide difference in the kinds of work individuals are willing to do. These differences make many kinds of products and services available. There are also wide differences in tastes and desires. This too is fortunate, for these differences make the world orderly. If everyone wanted the same things, we would all be struggling against each other to acquire what little was available. Diversity is the source of harmony in human relationships. Because our tastes are different, we can exchange with each other in a way that is mutually beneficial. If you and I have exactly the same values, there is no way we can trade. One of us will have what each of us wants most, and he won't give it up. With our difference in values, I can trade something to you for something I value more. You, on the other hand, will be getting something you want more than what you're giving up. Each of us improves the situation without hurting the other. This is a market, a compatibility of values that makes an exchange possible. Literally billions of such markets operate every day, as exchanges are made all over the world. For example, an employee trades his time and effort for something he wants more: money. An employer, meanwhile, trades his money for something he values more: the time and effort of the employee. These markets provide the only way to know exactly what individuals really want. Only when an individual gives up something he has in an exchange can you know how much he values the thing he says he desires. Human wants are limitless. We each want a multitude of things, far more than we could ever obtain with our limited resources. So to state a desire for something doesn't specify how much that thing is desired by the individual. Only when he offers to give up something in order to get it do we know how much he values it. Will the man who says he wants a yacht be willing to give up his car, food budget, his clothes and furniture in order to have the money to buy the yacht? Will the person who wants the poor to be fed be willing to go without entertainment for 6 months in order to raise money to give to the poor? Will the woman who wishes she had more time to spend with her children be willing to give up the women's club, cocktail parties, and bridge in order to have the time to spend at home? Desires are limitless. Resources are limited. These two conditions are the reasons that individuals must make choices. Individuals decide how they will use their limited resources to satisfy their strongest desires. In doing so, they develop value scales, which we can see only by looking at the exchanges they are willing to make. Perhaps an individual can't tell you exactly what's on his value scale, but he chooses in accordance with it when faced with a decision, and he chooses that which he believes will bring him the most happiness. Meeting place. Billions of exchanges take place daily, and they're expressions of the desires of billions of human beings. If we could somehow add up all the desires of all individuals in a given area, or the whole world, and compare that with the products and services available, we would have the general market. Not only is it impossible to make such a calculation, but even if we could, it would be outdated by the time we added up the figures. For the market is constantly changing. Each individual's values change constantly as he acquires new knowledge and new resources. And the availability of things to buy is constantly changing as producers make changes in what they offer to the public. So the general market constantly changes. But to whatever extent we can observe it, it represents an accurate expression of what people, in general, are choosing to do with their available resources. Within the general market, we find a multitude of differences in motivations. In the car market, one person buys a big car that satisfies his desires for comfort, prestige, and mobility. At the same time, another person buys a small car that gets him where he wants to go with a minimum of expense. What we see as a general market is the net effect or trend created by these many different purchases. But no matter what the overall trend, it contains within it numerous different desires, availabilities, and purchases. Types of transactions. Within the general market, there are two basic kinds of exchanges. The most common is a two-sided transaction, one in which each party participates because he wants to. The possible reasons for entering a two-sided exchange are endless. They include positive decisions made in order to increase one's happiness, such as buying a better car to drive, and negative decisions that are made because things would get worse without them, such as getting the roof fixed to avoid being flooded by rain. In each case, the individual enters the relationship because what is offered is better than what he had before. He could have left things as they were, but he prefers not to. In a one-sided transaction, one of the participants forces the other to choose between two new alternatives. He introduces violence, or the threat of it, as a way of making the unwilling participant a part of the relationship. A common example is a hold-up. A man points a gun at you and forces you to choose between violence and losing your money. You would prefer not to have to make any choice, but you're forced to. You can't leave things as they are. If you have to choose between paying to have your roof fixed and letting it leak, you're in a similar position. You can't leave things as they were before the roof started leaking. But your quarrel is with nature. In a holdup, it's another human being who's inflicted the negative decision upon you. If your wife confronts you with the choice of changing your ways or losing her, there too you must make a negative decision. But your participation in the relationship itself was a voluntary one. Unless it was a shotgun wedding, that is. Only the first example of the three was a one-sided transaction. A relationship between two human beings where one party has used violence to force the other to participate. It should be noted, however, that the thief isn't getting something for nothing. He still has to work for what he gets. He gives up his time, takes risks, pays for his gun, and works in other ways. No matter what you want or how you intend to get it, you have to pay a price for it. Exchanges. When we talk of government, we're talking of something that exists in the general market I have just described. So, let's sum up what we have seen in the ways people get what they want through the market. 1. Nothing is free. To acquire anything requires an expenditure of time, energy, or money. Not even natural resources can be used without an application of effort, whether that be cutting down a tree or picking up an apple. 2. Anything you want that you can't provide entirely for yourself requires an exchange with someone else. 3. A one-sided transaction doesn't provide a gain for the unwilling participant. Even if he receives something in return, it wouldn't be one-sided if he valued what he receives more than what he must give up, for then he would have entered the transaction willingly. 4. Whatever an individual does is the highest valued alternative that he believes is available to him. 5. At any given time, the general market reflects the consensus of the highest values the people therein believe possible. As individuals go about their business, they are getting the best they know how in the world as it is, speeding up history. But some people are impatient. They look about them and get the impression that things aren't moving as fast as they should be. They want to improve upon the natural automatic processes of the market. And so they form governments. They hope thereby to make more things available to more people more quickly. In addition, they hope to have their lives and property protected for a smaller price than they think it would cost without government. The basic mistake is the assumption that with a government, they will have more than what they would have had in the marketplace. The truth is that they wind up with less, for the government can give you something only by taking away something you wanted more. It's easy to think that government programs add to what's available, but they don't. They replace what was available. And we have already seen that at any given time, the general market expresses the highest valued desires of the people within it. So the government can only replace one thing with something valued less. People seek government action because they don't approve of what other people choose to do with their lives. They want to overrule the decisions others have made concerning the uses of their own time and money. It generally works this way. The individuals in Group A want something that requires the cooperation of Group B, but they can't, or won't, convince Group B that it's to the advantage of Group B. So Group A calls upon the government to pass a law that compels Group B to cooperate. For example, a few critics want American car manufacturers to build automobiles with more safety accessories than the car makers have chosen to include. The car makers have decided wisely, or not, that potential car buyers don't want those accessories enough to pay the extra price required. If Group A, the critics, can't convince either Group B, the manufacturers, or Group C, the buyers, of the importance of the safety additions, they still have some alternatives available. They could refuse to continue buying what they consider to be unsatisfactory cars, or they could publish their findings if there's enough interest to create a market. Instead, they choose to go to the government. They believe they must coercively impose their safety standards upon all car makers and car buyers, regardless of those individuals' values. If the laws are passed, some buyers may approve, even though they might not buy the new cars when the prices go up. Far more car buyers will be unhappy because they would have preferred less stringent standards and lower prices, which is why the car makers resisted the higher standards in the first place. Obviously, if they had thought most car buyers wanted to pay more for safer cars, they would have offered just that in order to sell more cars. Enforced conformity. Many people think we're protected against dishonesty or inefficiency through government licensing and inspection requirements. But different individuals want different kinds and amounts of protection. For example, you might decide not to buy something until you're assured that it's what you expect, by your standards. I, on the other hand, might hire someone else to protect my interests. A third person might prefer to risk his money rather than pay the expense of having a product guaranteed. The differences between us pose no problem. Each of us can do as he chooses, trusting or not trusting the people we deal with, paying for as much or as little protection as we want. When the government intervenes, however, all of us are required to adhere to standards set by government, and at a cost dictated by the government. Almost all of us are deprived of the choices we would have preferred. In a world of vastly different tastes, the government imposes one way upon us and forces everyone to adhere to that one way. Despite our differing tastes, the government decides which products we're allowed to buy. Federal agencies rule products out of the market, import quotas, prevent other products from being available, and legal monopolies, such as the Postal Service or public utilities, prevent us from choosing alternative ways of obtaining services. Again, our preferences are overruled, and we're forced to take what the government has decreed to be best, leaving us without the things we could have had without government intervention. Government regulation always overrules the consumers. What consumers don't want, they don't have to buy. What governments don't want, consumers can't buy. What consumers want, protection, inspection, etc., they can get. What the government thinks they should have, consumers are forced to take and forced to pay for it. It's important to recognize that these government decisions are not benevolent, kindly forms of advice and help. No, they are enforced by violence. If you should ever decide that your business will continue to provide what consumers want despite government regulations, you will be met with violence. You will be fined. If you refuse to pay the fine, your bank accounts will be seized. If you continue to provide what consumers prefer, you will be ordered to close your business. If you resist, gentlemen with guns will take you to jail. Absolutely every government regulation is enforced by violence. If you've never seen that violence, it's only because you've been careful, obedient, or lucky. Would regulations still be obeyed if the police, courts, and jails were dissolved? Government businesses. The same principles apply when governments set up businesses, schools, lending institutions, insurance companies, or foreign aid programs, etc. It's claimed that society needs them, and the free market won't or can't provide them. But who is society? If not the same people who are already expressing their needs and preferences in the marketplace. If they aren't willing to pay for the service in the free market, the general market apart from the government, who can say they're eager to pay for it through government? Who will provide the resources, time, energy, and money to pay for the services? Obviously, the cost will be borne by the same people who have already chosen to do other things with their resources. The government can't create resources out of thin air any more than you or I can. The resources will have to come from people who would rather use them for something else. Since there's no justification for that, various arguments are presented to demonstrate the value of government enterprises. For example, it's often said that a government business will pay its own way, meaning that consumers will buy its services at prices sufficient to pay its expenses. Why then bother to call upon the government? If the service were truly able to pay its own way, it would be profitable for someone else to offer it in the marketplace. If no one has, it means only that no one really believes it can pay its own way. The next argument claims that the government can offer the service without making a profit. But what is a profit? It is simply a net gain a person receives for the time, energy, and money he has expended. Will the workers in a government business donate their time and energies without pay? Obviously not. Perhaps what's meant is that there won't be any profit earned on the money invested. But that means someone's going to have his money confiscated and invested in a government business without getting the profit he would have made investing it in the free market. It's also claimed there will be no entrepreneurial profit, meaning no one will be paid for appraising the market to determine the desire for the service, putting the organization together and making sure it will run right. But who will make sure the business is sound? If the government claims it can do away with profit, it means either that 1. there has been no appraisal of the market potential for the service, or that 2, the appraisal has been done by someone who's grossly underpaid and thus not able to be relied upon, or that 3, the necessary appraisal has been stolen from somebody else, or that 4, the appraisal is being paid for with other government funds that won't show up on the ledgers of the enterprise. In any case, the non-profit claim is of no benefit to the public. No matter what the argument, the conclusion is the same. The government has no mysterious ability to do things that can't be done in the free market. It can't command resources that don't already exist. It can only overrule the decisions of its citizens, eliminating their alternatives and replacing those alternatives with activities they have desired less. It takes money from the general market and spends it on less valued choices, adding to the cost of itself in the process, and leaving people with less than they would have had if there were no government. Any individual in the general market can give to the poor, pay for someone else's schooling, donate money to foreign governments, or hire protection. It isn't his choice he's concerned about when he wants the government to do those things. It's someone else's choice that he is trying to overrule. All government actions depend upon one-sided transactions in which an individual is forced to choose between paying for what he doesn't want and going to jail. These principles apply to any government, from the local school board to the federal government. Governments don't rule, they overrule. Why governments? Why, then, do governments have such widespread acceptance? I can think of 3 reasons. 1. Most people believe that governments add to the general well-being rather than reduce it. They haven't recognized the simple economic truths we've covered here. 2. Many individuals believe they're getting more benefits from the government than they give up. They pay a price in taxes and reduced alternatives, many of which they may not even have recognized, but feel that they get back more in subsidies and special privileges. In other words, they don't think that society benefits, but believe that they individually come out ahead. As Frederick Bastiat put it, the state is the great fictitious entity by which everyone expects to live at the expense of everyone else. The same attitude can apply in non-financial matters. A person may be pleased with laws that keep others from smoking marijuana, or buying what they want, or associating with whomever they choose. He's glad to see the government imposing his tastes upon everyone else. 3. The last-ditch argument for government is that it is necessary for the protection of life and property. It's easy to assume that without government, we would be at the mercy of thieves, rapists, and murderers. How would you protect yourself if there were no government? Chances are you'd protect yourself by locking your doors, staying out of dangerous areas, keeping your children away from situations where they can't protect themselves, and choosing whom you will allow in your home. Sound familiar? It should, for that's probably what you're doing already. Governments don't protect you. They can't. All they can do is promise to make the person who hurts you pay for his crime. If they can catch him, that is. The criminal won't pay you back, of course, so they punish him only as a deterrent to further crime. If you think the deterrent is working, why is crime always such a public issue? Occasionally, a government cop actually prevents a specific crime from taking place, or from being completed. The odds against that are tremendous, however. If you want to eliminate all risk of violence, your only recourse is to pay for a guard to watch over you and your property day and night. And if that's what you want, you can hire a guard to do it, but the price you already pay to the government won't purchase him. Small wonder, then, that the LA Chief of Police advised residents to bar their doors, buy a police dog, call us when we're available, and pray, as the best methods of protecting themselves from crime. Enter the syndicate. There is no way an individual can escape having to protect himself, with or without a government. But it's assumed that no one person can protect himself against what's called organized crime. The the mafia, or other syndicates. How can an individual cope with a problem so large? Why not? No individual could build a shopping center by himself, since the materials must be obtained from hundreds of remote places around the world, and thousands of operations are required to build the buildings. Somehow, though, the job gets done through the voluntary associations of literally millions of people throughout the world, and no one has to be coerced to make it possible. If governments didn't coercively monopolize the market for protection, there would undoubtedly be more forms of protection offered on a voluntary basis to those who feel threatened by organized crime. But let's assume for the moment that individuals would be helpless against organized crime if the government didn't protect them. We could paint a pretty grim picture of the mafia's effect upon our lives. What is it that we fear would happen if the mafia were unrestrained by the government? Here are some of the problems we assume we'd face. 1. So-called protection rackets would flourish. Businessmen would have to pay tribute to the mafia or be violently put out of business. 2. Extortion would run rampant. You might have to pay off the mafia in order to prevent being pushed around or for the privilege of getting a job. 3. If worst came to worst, you might even have to pay off the syndicate just to be allowed to remain on your own property. If so, you would never own anything outright. You would always have to pay someone for the privilege of keeping what you thought was yours. 4. The syndicate might even tell you where you could work, or where you'd have to work, or how to run your business, or what kind of services they'd let you offer, or perhaps they would even prevent you from competing with their own businesses. Who could stop them? 5. And they might take the profits from their rackets and use them to compete with your business, using your own money to cut into your market. That's a pretty grim picture. Would you want to live in such an environment? You'd have to pay for the privilege of working, going into business, staying on your own property. You would be told what you couldn't do in your relationships with customers and friends, and you might even have to finance your own competitors. And so, to prevent that nightmare from becoming a reality, we have a government. And what does the government do? 1. It imposes corporation taxes, license fees, and sales taxes upon businessmen, coercively shutting down any business that doesn't pay. 2. It seizes income taxes as payment for the privilege of working. 3. It gives you the one-sided choice of paying property taxes or losing your property. So, as economist F.A. Harper has pointed out, you don't actually own anything. You rent from the government. Sales between individuals are only exchanges of the privilege of renting property from the government. He who doesn't pay in the annual rental is forcibly evicted from his property. 4. The government decrees what products you can offer to your customers through the Federal Trade Commission and other agencies, and how much you can charge for your services, setting both minimum and maximum limits for wages and prices, requires massive bookkeeping, and imposes many other rules upon your business or your employment. And if it gets into trouble with other governments, it can even enslave you in its army to fight and possibly die on its behalf. The government delegates some of its coercive powers to labor unions, which in turn prevent many people from working at jobs where they would otherwise be employed on a mutually profitable basis. The government will prevent you from going into the business of delivering first-class mail, even though prior to that law, private postal companies delivered the mail for a lower price, gave faster services, and made profits for themselves. If that weren't enough, try starting your own phone company. 5. On top of all of this, the government uses the money it takes from you to operate businesses that may be in competition with your own. It has mortgage companies, ladies' underwear factories, charities, print shops, laundries, and hundreds more. Since it can always come back to you to cover its losses, it usually charges less for its products than you would have to charge to stay in business. So, to protect you from the crime syndicates, the government makes you pay tribute for the privileges of working, going into business, or staying on your own property. It dictates the terms of your relationships with customers and friends. It finances your competitors with your own money, and it can even enslave you in its army. What could the mafia do that would be worse? It's important to realize that a two-sided transaction is no threat to you. If someone offers you something, you can turn it down. And surprisingly, most of the crime the government presumes to protect us against are two-sided transactions the government doesn't approve of. For example, the U.S. News and World Report claims that the total yearly take from organized crime is roughly $19.7 billion. But a closer look at the figures indicates that less than $1 billion of that is in crimes of violence. Over 90% of the total is in two-sided transactions like gambling, loan sharking, alcohol, prostitution, and drugs. You can simply decline to participate in any of that. In addition, much of the government's law enforcement is devoted to preventing free market transactions between willing participants. Enforcement of fair competition laws, licensing laws, etc. And to do this, the government imposes a one-sided transaction upon you. Surprisingly, you can avoid most of what is labeled crime by a simple choice not to participate. But you are not given the choice to avoid participating with the protector. Since you already pay separately for the things that actually protect you, locks, alarm systems, insurance, watchdogs, etc., would protection be much more expensive if there were no government? National defense. What about national defense? Isn't the nation safe from foreign enemies only because of the government? What is a nation? In common usage, a nation is considered to be a geographical area under the jurisdiction of a single government that isn't a subdivision of a larger government. The government assumes responsibility for the defense of the geographical area and makes all decisions regarding armed conflict with outsiders. If there were no government, there would be no nation. And if there were no nation, there would be nothing to defend. If that sounds too simple, think about it. No aggressor conquers a nation by overwhelming every single inhabitant and occupying every part of the geographical area. It would be far too expensive and unrealistic to do so. Instead, the aggressor applies force against the country until the government of that nation surrenders. Then the aggressor takes over the existing governmental machinery to enforce the occupation. If no such machinery existed, how could it possibly enforce the occupation? Hitler couldn't have conquered Europe without the help provided by the governments of the occupied nations. Would he have sent every one of his Nazis into Norway to police all the Norwegians? If he had, who would have been left at home to police the Germans? That doesn't mean that aggression would stop if there were no governments, but the aggression would be no more formidable than the examples of crime we have already covered. Hydrogen bombs and other modern tools of war are effective only when they can be used to pressure governments. Enemy rulers have nothing to gain by destroying U.S. property and people, except as a means of pressuring the government to surrender. Otherwise, the more they destroy, the less value to them in conquering the nation. If there were no federal government in the U.S., the communists would have to conquer 50 different state governments, which would be far more difficult. But what if there were no state governments? Then they would have to conquer every town separately. But what if there weren't any town governments? No governments at all. Then they would have to make 200 million separate conquests and use millions of their own policemen to set up new governments. Obviously, the answer to the threat of communism or any other enemy is not a stronger government to defend us, but just the opposite. We would be far safer if there were no government to conquer. It's surprising how many national issues, problems that cry out for government intervention, wouldn't even exist if there were no governments. The dictators of the world have always operated in countries where there is a strong respect for government. The prevailing European awe of the state has produced an endless number of tyrants, wars, and low standards of living. And now that generations of Americans have been taught that governments are vital to their well-being, present-day Americans are afflicted with all the problems that invariably result from government. Such a trend has developed over many lifetimes. It won't be reversed within hours. Governments grow naturally because individuals see them as ways of increasing their rewards at lower expense. It's an oversimplification to say that people want something for nothing. All people want to obtain as much as possible for as little effort as possible. That's why labor-saving devices are valuable. Unfortunately, however, government isn't the labor-saving device it appears to be. It always gives back less than it takes. But because it does appear to be a giver of good things, its appeal is almost universal, and there isn't much likelihood that the trend will be reversed. The government traps. Let's take another look now at the 4 government traps. Trap 1. The belief that government performs socially useful functions that deserve your support. If all the individual gains or losses caused by an act could be totaled, the net total would be the social effect. While this could never be tabulated, we have seen logically that any governmental activity will provide less than what the general market has already made available. When everyone's values are taken into consideration, the government's services replace services that have been valued more highly by the general market. Trap 2. The belief that you have a duty to obey laws. The obligation to obey laws is a good example of one person trying to manipulate another through the use of moral dictums. Your obedience doesn't even perform a socially useful function. It only enhances coercion and disorder. The only relevant consideration is the personal consequence to you, what you will gain if you break a law versus the loss imposed upon you if you're caught, together with the degree of risk that you will be caught. If you choose to obey a law, it should be because of the consequences to you, not because you have an obligation. Trap number 3. The belief that government can be counted upon to carry out a social reform you favor. Even if you are willing to try to use the government for your own purposes, it isn't likely to bring about the changes you seek. Any government program can be made to sound promising at the time it's introduced, but just look back over the past 20 years or so to see what the actual results have been. The foreign aid that was going to save the world from communism has actually been used to enrich various nations before they fell to the communists. Cuba, China, Eastern Europe, etc. And it's been used to finance both sides of the wars in Vietnam, the Dominican Republic, and other places. Back in 1964, the government started promising an early end to the Vietnam War, but the promises and realities were far, far apart. At home, look at the many housing projects that were going to do away with slums. Where can a government point to a slum-free big city as proof of its effectiveness? Remember the War on Poverty, the Alliance for Progress, the Full Employment Act of 1946? Grand dreams, lots of money spent, no success. Governments have a consistent record of failure in their endeavors. Even if you are willing to force others to pay for what you want, no government is going to solve the ecology problems, make women professional equals, prevent monopolies, or fulfill any other objective you may have in mind. Working through government to get what you want is a classic example of an indirect alternative. The success of your plans depends far more upon what other people do than upon your own decisions. First, you have to rally public support so that Congress will act. Then you must hope that the president and the bureaucracy will carry out the plan as you intended it. You have to go through thousands of people to get to your objective. Whatever it is you want, there's bound to be direct alternative available that requires only your own decision. If there are people you want to aid, for example, you can accomplish far more by keeping the taxes and paying the money directly to those people. The government can't carry out your plans for you, but you can. Trap number 4. The fear that the government is so powerful that it can prevent you from being free. We've seen in this chapter the principles upon which a government is organized. It attempts to overrule a general market and inflict its way upon individuals. Fortunately, the government is subject to the same market principles that we are. Its resources are limited, so it can't hope to enforce its laws adequately by policing every person individually. The government is organized as one gigantic group trap. Since it can't escape the consequences of a mistaken policy any more than we can, it operates very inefficiently. Many people think things would be better if the government were only more efficient. Happily, it isn't. For collectively, we are free to the extent that the government is inefficient and unable to carry out its coercive programs. And individually, you are free to the extent that you take advantage of the government's inefficiency. What is government? The government traps and snare many people because they never stop to recognize what a government is. It's an agency of coercion that's accepted as necessary by most people within its area of influence. It differs from the mafia only in that the mafia isn't usually considered necessary by the people in the communities it serves. Governments usually do enjoy that respect. Even those people who want the ins replaced by the outs consider the institution itself to be necessary. I don't expect to see a world in which there would be no theft, aggression, or coercion, but it would be refreshing to live in one in which no agency of coercion had the acceptance of most of the people around me. Dealing with an agency of coercion would be much easier if you didn't also have to deal with law-abiding neighbors who act as unpaid functionaries of the state. I believe a world without government would be a better place to live. However, that doesn't tell me how to deal with the world in which I do live. But a realistic understanding of government keeps you out of the government traps. You won't waste precious time and energy trying to work through the government to become free. Nor will you allow blind allegiance or patriotism to keep you from living your life as you want to live it. Nor will you be deterred by the government's apparent powers. There's nothing to be gained by trying to make the government more efficient, by trying to get the bad guys out and the good guys in. The government has nothing to offer you. And therein lies the answer to the famous cliche, the government should do for the people only what they cannot do for themselves. There is nothing the government can do for you that you can't do for yourself. Far less expensively, far more easily, and far more securely. And you can do it for yourself without first having to obtain the approval of the electorate, the establishment, or anyone else.